Every American who set foot in Vietnam arrived with a number in his head. 365 days, one for each day of a standard army tour, 13 months for the Marines. The number counted down from the moment the transport touched the runway, and it governed everything that followed. A man could measure his entire war in the distance between that number and zero. The peculiar thing, the thing that separated Vietnam from earlier American conflicts, was what happened as the number shrank. Soldiers did not grow calmer as their tours ended. They grew more afraid. The men closest to going home, the ones with the least time left to risk, often became the most cautious, the most superstitious, and in some cases the most paralyzed by dread. This is the story of the short timer and of the particular species of fear that lived in the final weeks of a Vietnam tour. The rotation system that produced this fear was itself a deliberate choice, and understanding why it existed explains a great deal about the mindset it created. In the Second World War, American soldiers deployed for the duration. A man went overseas and stayed until the war ended. He was wounded badly enough to be sent home, or he was killed. There was no calendar to count down, only the war itself. Vietnam operated on an entirely different principle. The Department of Defense adopted an individual rotation policy under which each service member served a fixed tour and then rotated home, regardless of whether the war was won, lost, or unchanged. The Army settled on 12 months, the Marine Corps on 13. The reasoning was partly political and partly managerial. A fixed tour limited the exposure of any individual, spread the burden across a larger pool of men, and made the war more sustainable at home by promising families a defined endpoint. It also meant that units were in a constant state of turnover, with men arriving and departing on individual schedules rather than as cohesive formations. Central to the whole arrangement was a single date that every man knew by heart. It was called the DEROS, the date eligible for return from overseas, and it was calculated the moment a soldier arrived. From that fixed point, everything counted backward. The DEROS was more than an administrative entry. It was the organizing fact of a soldier's existence in Vietnam, the horizon toward which every day moved. Psychiatrists who studied the American experience in the war would later argue that the DEROS functioned as a psychological anchor unlike anything in previous conflicts, giving each man a private and immovable finish line. It offered a form of hope that the open-ended tours of earlier wars never had. A soldier in the Second World War could not know when his war would end. A soldier in Vietnam knew to the day. That certainty was a comfort through most of the tour, and it became a torment at the close, when the anchor that had steadied a man began instead to pull at him. The consequences of that decision shaped daily life in every unit in country. Because each man tracked his own calendar, a rifle company was never a single body moving toward a shared goal. It was a collection of individuals at wildly different points in their tours. The new arrival, freshly assigned and still learning which sounds mattered, shared a foxhole with a man who had 2 weeks left and wanted nothing more than to survive them. The Army had a vocabulary for these gradations. A man newly arrived was often called a new guy, sometimes less politely. A man with less than 100 days remaining was a short-timer, and he announced it constantly. As the number dropped, the announcements grew more elaborate. Men carried short-timer calendars, often drawings divided into numbered segments that were filled in one per day, many of them shaped in ways that would not pass inspection in a stateside barracks. The countdown was not private. It was a shared ritual, a running commentary on exactly how much war each man had left to endure. Those calendars became small works of obsessive attention, and the act of filling it carried a weight out of all proportion to the ink. Each marked square was a day survived, a piece of the war permanently behind him and beyond the reach of whatever waited in the field. Men guarded these calendars, showed them off, and compared them. To lose one felt like bad luck. The ritual gave shape to time that otherwise dissolved into an undifferentiated stretch of patrols and nights on watch, and it let a man see his progress toward an end that the war itself did everything to obscure. The material culture of the countdown extended beyond paper, and one particular object captures it with unusual precision: It was a narrow strip of navy blue and yellow nylon, roughly 6 inches long and less than half an inch wide, and it came from no quartermaster. The fabric was the decorative band wrapped around the packaging of a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey. Servicemen repurposed it as an unofficial badge, a short-timer's ribbon, signifying that a man had fewer than 90 days left to serve. The detail worth pausing on is that men wore a whiskey bottle ribbon alongside their official decorations, pinned to the same bar as a commendation medal or a campaign ribbon. The countdown had produced its own insignia, unsanctioned and instantly legible to anyone who knew what it meant. To the men who wore it, being short was an accomplishment that belonged on the same shelf as a decoration the army had actually issued. The environment that Countdown ran against was one of persistent, low-grade, most unbearable gamble. He had survived hundreds of days. To die now, with the finish line in sight, struck men as a particularly cruel and pointless outcome. And in a war full of deaths that felt pointless, that was saying something. The fear expressed itself in behavior that unit commanders knew well and often struggled to manage. Short-timers became risk-averse in ways that could compromise a unit's effectiveness. A man near the end of his tour might hesitate on point, volunteer for nothing, and seek every excuse to remain inside the wire. Some became almost immobilized by caution, checking and rechecking, flinching at sounds they had ignored for months. The condition was common enough to be understood as a normal stage of the tour, rather than a personal failing, though it created real tactical problems. The most experienced men in a platoon, the ones whose knowledge was most valuable, were frequently the ones most consumed by the desire to stop taking risks. A squad leader with 300 days behind him and 3 weeks ahead of him was worth more than any replacement, and he was also the man most likely to freeze. Superstition filled the space that logic could not. Men who understood perfectly well that a booby trap did not care about the date became intensely ritualistic as their tours ended. They carried talismans, repeated routines, and avoided anything that felt like tempting fate. Speaking too confidently about going home was widely regarded as an invitation to disaster, and men policed each other's language accordingly. To announce that you had it made, that nothing could touch you now, was to court exactly the outcome you feared. The reasoning was not rational, but it served a psychological function. In a war where so much was beyond a man's control, ritual offered the illusion of some. If death was random, then perhaps the small things a man could control, the routines and the silences and the lucky objects, might tilt the odds. The institutional response to short-timer anxiety varied, and where it existed at all, it reflected a recognition that the fear was real and operationally significant. In some units, commanders made informal efforts to pull men off the most dangerous duties as their departure approached. A soldier in his final days might be reassigned from patrol to a base camp task, given work that kept him inside the perimeter, or simply excused from point. This was never universal policy, and it depended heavily on the manpower a unit could spare and the disposition of the officers in charge. A company short on riflemen could not afford to bench its experienced men, whatever their proximity to rotation. But the practice existed widely enough to be recognized, and it acknowledged something commanders understood instinctively. A frightened short-timer was a liability in the field, and a dead one so close to home was terrible for morale. That effect on morale points to a broader truth about how the rotation system shaped unit cohesion. Because men arrived and left individually, a soldier's most intense loyalties were often to a small group whose composition was constantly shifting. Friendships formed around shared time in country, and the departure of a man who had reached his rotation date was a complicated event. It was cause for genuine happiness, and it was also a reminder to everyone left behind of exactly how much time they still owed. When a short-timer was killed in his final days, the impact on a unit was severe precisely because it violated the promise the whole system was built on. The tour was supposed to be survivable. It had an end. A man who died within sight of that end demonstrated that the calendar guaranteed nothing, and that knowledge corroded the psychological scaffolding the rotation was meant to provide. The phenomenon acquired a grim shorthand in the ranks. To die when nearly out of danger, whether near the end of a tour or after long survival, was to have been killed as a short-timer, and the phrase carried a specific weight. Everyone understood the particular tragedy of it. The historical record is full of these cases, and they lodged in the memories of the men who witnessed them because they confirmed the deepest short-timer fear. There are accounts of men killed days before they were due to fly home, of soldiers who had already packed, of replacements arriving to take over from men who did not live to make the handoff. These were not statistically dominant among casualties. Most men who reached the end of their tours went home, but the exceptions carried disproportionate psychological force, because every short-timer measured his own odds against them. The way these deaths were absorbed by a unit reveals how deeply the countdown structured everything. When a man with long time remaining was killed, the loss was felt as part of the war's ordinary arithmetic, terrible but expected. When a short-timer died, the reaction was different in kind. It was often accompanied by a superstitious recalibration among the men who remained, a renewed conviction that the final stretch was the most dangerous, whatever the statistics said. This belief was self-reinforcing. Because the deaths of short-timers were remembered so vividly and discussed so often, they came to seem more frequent than they were, which in turn intensified the dread of every man approaching his own DEROS. The mind was building a picture out of its most memorable evidence, and the most memorable evidence was always the man who almost made it. A veteran might struggle to recall the name of a replacement killed in his first week, and never forget the squad leader shot on the trail with 11 days left. The situation was made stranger by the constant presence of men at the opposite end of the countdown. The new arrival's fearlessness was not courage, it was ignorance, and the veterans knew it. There was a well-observed and darkly practical weariness of new men in the field, because their inexperience made them dangerous to everyone around them. A replacement who had not yet learned to move quietly, to read the ground, or to control the impulse to fire at shadows could get a whole squad killed. Seasoned soldiers often kept new men at a deliberate distance, physically and emotionally, until they had survived long enough to be trusted. This meant that the short-timer, at his most anxious, was frequently surrounded by exactly the men he found most alarming to depend on, while the veterans he trusted were themselves rotating out one by one. The unit was always renewing itself at both ends, and the man in the middle of his tour watched the experience drain away around him. The pattern that emerged across the war had several consistent features. The fear intensified as the DEROS approached rather than easing. It struck hardest at the most experienced men whose survival knowledge had become a map of every way to die. It expressed itself through caution, superstition, and withdrawal from risk. And it was, in strictly statistical terms, disproportionate to the actual danger of any given final day. These four elements appeared again and again in accounts from across the conflict, from the early deployments of the mid-1960s through the drawdown years, suggesting that the phenomenon was structural rather than tied to any particular phase of the fighting. Wherever the individual tour operated, the short-timer's fear followed. Certain roles and situations concentrated short-timer anxiety more than others, and the differences reveal how the fear tracked actual risk. An infantryman in a line company faced the countdown at its sharpest, because his daily exposure was highest and most direct. A man in a support role at a large base, by contrast, might count down with far less dread, since his statistical danger was lower to begin with, though rocket and mortar attacks meant that no position in Vietnam was entirely safe. Helicopter crews occupied their own category. Door gunners and crew chiefs flew mission after mission, and their exposure did not decline as their tours ended, since a man was needed in the aircraft until the day he left. For them, the short-timer period offered no natural reduction in risk, only a rising awareness of how many flights stood between them and departure. The men who flew and the men who walked the worst ground developed their coping mechanisms accordingly. Some threw themselves harder into the work, on the theory that competence was the best protection and that fear made a man careless. Others withdrew, doing the minimum, husbanding their nerve. Humor ran through all of it, dark and constant, because naming the fear openly and joking about it was easier than carrying it in silence. The short-timers boast and the ritual complaints about how few days remained functioned as a way of holding an unbearable anxiety at a manageable distance. A man who joked that he was too short to go on patrol was expressing a real terror through an acceptable form. The claims grew competitive and absurd. A man might announce that he was so short he could parachute off a dime, or that he needed a ladder to climb out of his own boots. The exaggeration was the point. By reducing the countdown to a running joke, a soldier could speak the fear aloud without admitting how completely it gripped him. The reality that made the final days psychologically distinct was not that they were more dangerous in any measurable sense. A patrol on a man's 350th day was no more lethal than one on his 50th. The difference was entirely in the mind, in the changed relationship between risk and reward. Early in a tour, a man had everything to lose in the abstract and a full year of danger to absorb, which paradoxically made each individual day easier to face. Late in a tour, he had everything to lose in the concrete and only a handful of days left to lose it in. The stakes of each remaining moment rose even as the actual danger held steady. This is a distinction worth sitting with, because it explains why the fear was so resistant to reassurance. Telling a short-timer that his odds were unchanged did nothing, because his odds were never the point. The point was that he could now imagine the alternative in full color, and the imagining was unbearable. The psychological literature that emerged from the war would later place this experience within a larger pattern of combat stress, but the men living through it needed no framework to understand what was happening to them. They felt the shift directly. The soldier who had moved through the middle of his tour with a kind of grim competence would find, in his final weeks, that the competence had curdled into hyper-vigilance. Sounds that he had learned to ignore now jolted him. Trails he had walked without thought now seemed thick with menace. The knowledge that had kept him alive was now a catalogue of everything that could go wrong, replaying at the worst possible time. Some men welcomed their final reassignment to the rear with relief so intense it approached collapse. Others carried the tension all the way to the aircraft, unable to believe they were safe until the wheels left the runway. That final flight, the movement out of the war, deserves attention because of how completely it severed a man from the experience. There was no decompression, no gradual return. A soldier could be on patrol 1 week and back in the United States the next, still carrying the reflexes and the fear that had kept him alive, with no war around him to justify them. The individual rotation system that produced the short-timer's dread also produced this abrupt ending, and the two were connected. A man went to war alone, on his own schedule, and he came home alone the same way. The unit he left behind continued without him, its collective countdown resetting around the men who remained. His departure changed nothing about the war and everything about his own place in it. The rotation policy had been designed with sound intentions. It limited individual exposure, distributed the burden, and gave families a date to hold on to. Whether it served the larger war effort is a separate and much debated question, since the constant turnover meant that units were perpetually integrating new men and losing experienced ones, and that institutional knowledge drained away with every rotation. A company might reach a high level of effectiveness only to lose its best men to the calendar and begin the cycle again. From the standpoint of building a cohesive, experienced fighting force, the individual tour worked against the Army's interests. But it was never really designed to build such a force. It was designed to make a long and increasingly unpopular war sustainable, and on that narrower measure, it functioned as intended, at a psychological cost borne by the men who counted down inside it. The short-timer's fear, then, was not a weakness or an aberration. It was the predictable product of a system that turned every soldier into an accountant of his own survival. Give a man a number, let him watch it shrink, place a vivid future just past its end, and expose him daily to random death, and the fear that results is not a malfunction. It is the mind working exactly as it should, correctly identifying that the closer the exit, the more intolerable it becomes to fall short of it. The men who joked about being too short to fight were describing something true. They had learned the war too well, and the learning had taught them precisely how much they now had to lose at the exact moment they could least afford to think about it.